everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing, and very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, unless, of course, it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. Dean Swinford was on in the halcyon days of Writing the Rapids, and he's back now to talk about his third book in the death metal epic series, the third and final book, Sinister, Synthesizer. Dean Swinford likes all kinds of music: death metal, black metal, doom metal, grindcore, funeral doom, power metal, drone, Christian metal, industrial metal, gothic rock, dark wave, hair metal, neoclassical, prog, thrash, dark ambient, dungeon synth, and even, on rare occasions, new metal. He lives in North Carolina. If you would like to support this show, you can do so in a few ways. The free way is to go on to Spotify, listen to an episode or two, because they don't let you rate it unless you listen to it. So if you don't listen on Spotify, go to Spotify, listen to an episode or two, and then rate it 5 stars so that the Spotify algorithm will tell other people to listen to it too. You can also toss me some money. You can go to patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. If you do that, you'll get episodes early. You could go to paypal.me/noisemakerjoe and just toss me a little donation, or you could buy my book. It's called Tired, and it's on Amazon. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Dean. So we've come to the close of the trilogy of the death metal epic, and first of all, congratulations. I think this is the first like completed series that I've covered on this show. And I guess we'll kind of start with that, the idea of the series, because it presents itself from the beginning as a trilogy. Mm-hmm. And so how much of it was kind of planned from the beginning, and how much did you discover along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's basically taken about 10 years to do the whole thing. So especially with COVID and everything, I was kind of like, with the third book, there were a lot of challenges to getting it done and everything, but I was able to get it done. So that was good. As far as the planning of the whole thing, there are parts of the third book that I actually wrote probably when I was doing the first book. I had an idea for how I wanted everything to end, like a few ideas that from the very beginning I had been working with. But the actual ending, which I don't want to talk about too much, but I kind of had like a happier ending in mind for poor David Fosberg, but I ended up not going with that and kind of ending it where I did. But other than that, along the way, if you were to go back and look at the books, like the first and second, then you would see kind of the buildup of some of the things that are in the third book that are just kind of mentioned, or there's a little bit about in the first couple. So the seeds have been there through the whole thing. And so I just kind of been trying to weave it all together over time.
Okay. That makes sense. I found that, and maybe we talked about this the first time, but that episode is years old now, so it's I'd forgive anybody for not knowing either. But this sort of tells like an alternate history of black metal, I feel like, mm-hmm. right? Like it's set around the same time, it's set in a different country, right. But there's a lot of, especially with I'm gonna like portmanteau the names together. Nordicron
and Nordicron.
Yes. Yeah. Especially their dynamic feels very reminiscent of the Euronymous and Varg stuff, and between that and the feeling that it's a coming of age story, but almost like a metal coming of age story, like a coming of age of the genre.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's both, right? So you have the character who's trying to figure out, here's this thing that I care about that he's invested a lot of time in, but he's not sure that it's doing anything for him. And so he's trying to figure all of that sort of stuff out. I tried to, with each book, include so many different elements of metal kind of in that time period, because I really see that as being where, even today you could still track or trace so many of the main metal genres back to that period, like things that are just kind of coming out of that period. And so I wanted it to be, in that sense, touching on all of those different genres and subgenres. I think, the way I've generally explained is like the first book is really about death metal, the second book's really about black metal, the third book is about the fragmentation of genres. And in this, if we were to say, the third book talks a lot about dungeon synth, but the other side of it is like a resurgence of classic metal. So that's kind of the other theme in there. And I guess I kind of see that within that period. But I guess, your initial question about like metal history and everything like that, I didn't want to write a book that was just like another iteration of this, Norwegian black metal story that everybody at this point knows. But I wanted to work with some of those different themes or ideas. And so setting it in a different country, having characters who are not connected to that, but I make occasional nods, like to an awareness that of the real world outside of the imaginary world of the death metal epic. So there's a sense that these two worlds or two stories are coexisting. And I think along with that, as if you just think about music scenes as well, is that people have this idea, of what was the most famous thing going on at a particular point. But there are always hundreds of other places and stories and things happening to people. And with the series, I'm really more interested in that. I'm more interested in the people who are not the winners of the music world. And that's kind of, I think that would contribute to that focus in the books.
Yeah, and I found that having previously been in a metal band when I was a kid in high school, that like watching everybody kind of figure that all out at the same time, right? And move in different directions. Like, of all the people I know who played music when I was in high school and doing music stuff, like, I don't know any of them are making a living off of music or even really doing it anymore. I'm not in a ton of contact with a lot of those guys, but there's that like, I don't know, this feeling that like when you're in it, that like it's the only thing.
Yeah.
And then you're out of it and you're like, oh wow, like I'm surprised I got as far as I did.
Right. Well, and I think, that's another thing, like with these books and what I might write about next is just this. I'm really interested in how these pop culture things really shape contemporary identity in ways that I don't think people talk about in a lot of depth, beyond like someone had their phase where they did this or they did that. But I think for lots of things, these different kind of pop culture fixations really serve as a kind of almost like a form of belief for people, a source of like life practices and everything like that. I mean, the other thing that I'm really into besides metal is skateboarding. I grew up skateboarding, and like the next project I would want to do would probably be something about that. And I still skate. I have friends who are old like me, and we skate together and everything like that. And to me, it's a really similar kind of thing where here's this thing that shapes your day-to-day reality, like things that you think about or what's important to you and all of that sort of stuff. But that in on the one hand it's really important, on the other hand it's totally meaningless. And I think that it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of interesting, or that's something that I guess that I'm interested in. And in the books I have the characters kind of grappling with that. And in this series, there's only one there's really only one guy who actually makes it. I don't want to talk about that too much, but you know, so it's similar to your experience and probably similar to the experience of lots of people.
Even in the sort of the side characters, like you get that near the end where Svart's world view is kind of being like collapsed around him, and he's like, oh, these people I really looked up to and thought that they were, you know, actual magicians, actual wizards, are like just kind of weird dudes. And you know, I think there's a lot of kind of little moments in culture surrounding music that like happens too, and it's generally like more outsidery types of music, it feels like dubstep had that moment, like the pre-Skrillex dubstep in the UK, where it was just like everything for a smallish group of guys who were a certain age, or like early footwork music or something like that too, where it's just like it completely creates like this whole other world. And that's definitely, we kind of got there, but like that's kind of what David is grappling with, right? Where it's like, at one point he's kind of made to believe that like metal is somehow beneath him or should be beneath him. And well,
yeah, and I guess that's the other thing, right? So, you know, on the other hand, if you're into something like that, at least this was true, it's true for me, you know, you have people telling you that there's something wrong with it.
mm-hmm.
And as a result, there's something wrong with you because you like it. And I think that that's really interesting too, just how people work through that and make peace with that. And it could be with any number of things, you know. But I mean, and again, in my experience, I see that, I have seen that a lot with metal or punk rock or skateboarding or any of those things. That it's interesting because those are all things that are really kind of like ascendant in pop culture, right? Or hip hop, you know, anything like that. That, but then there are always people telling you, well, you know, at least when I was growing up, that these were things that were bad for you. And what's interesting as I get older, I find that these are things that have actually given a lot of value and have helped me out a lot in my life. And so that's kind of a weird thing to think through. And yeah, so for him, it's like in his relationships too, where he's trying to figure that out as well. But then he's, you know, dealing with this relationship where the person's telling him that he's a loser because he likes metal, you know. So there are a lot of ways that comes through in the third book, and he's trying to grapple with that.
I wonder too if there's something to that when it comes to like all the guys who are in like the early punk bands who get photographed wearing like MAGA shirts nowadays, or like, was it one of the Ramones said something like he always thought punk rock was extremely right wing and conservative, and so you're like, when you're in this thing, it's super, you know, generally punk rock is considered fairly left wing or at least nihilistic, and then all these guys grow up and get old, and you know, and are now like, or even hip hop too. I mean, the NWA guys going from singing "Fuck the Police" to playing Police on TV, or Kanye West doing his whole weird arc. I wonder if there's something to that where it's like, I don't know. It feels like it's more than just being a contrarian, but maybe that's all it is.
Yeah, I don't know. But those are the things, I guess, in terms of, you know, so that the book's not just also trying to present metal as this, like, you know, as a kind of mediated or commodified thing, or like as an image or something that is there, you know, in the world of celebrity. Instead, I really wanted to get with just showing characters who have these real world struggles, but they're interacting with this world of fantasy or whatever that's connected to that. And then I think too that that's where, like, the books also make these moves to connect to like mythology or global literature and stuff like that. So that there's this idea too that it's kind of like two things at once. On the one hand, it's like metal is totally meaningless and has no purpose. On the other hand, it's like it's connected to the most important things of all, like art and poetry and spirit and all of that sort of stuff. And so it's these characters, like, I guess, moving between these two opposite things that are both kind of true, even though they cancel each other out.
Right. There's a line in the book where one of the characters says the heretic is the only true believer.
Yes, right. And then so like the Nordicron in the church, so
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting too. Because I mean, in general, right, there's so much of this focus on black metal or metal being anti-religious, but then so much of the themes and ideas are really indistinguishable. And so like there's the part where he has the prayer book and he's turning these lines from psalms into what are pretty pitch perfect metal lyrics, and those are actual lines. He just modifies them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then too, I think just musically, like, so there's this whole dungeon synth element to it, but there's also like what is the first dungeon synth? What is the first synth in the dungeon? The pipe organ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like the way that Bach comes into play also. It's kind of like this guiding force of music, and obviously that influences metal quite a bit. So trying to show some of those interconnections or those cultural influences that often get overlooked or not presented. And I guess the flip side of that too is then I've got Unicorn, the Christian metal band, which again I put in, I wanted to, as far as the expansiveness of the books, it was kind of like, well, that's an important genre too. But I think a lot of people would overlook something like that. And I think too is just kind of like the way that the third book has this move back to power metal or classic metal, and so that was also just a way to really give an example of a band that exemplifies that. But at the same time, the guys in that band they've been like washed up from the 80s, so they're not going to make it in this career sense, but the music they're making is really inspiring to David and even to Svart, even though Svart wants to hate it at first.
Yeah, I think that metal is, especially in my life, a really interesting kind of starting point for a lot of things, like the classical music elements, the folk music elements, the religion. There's a progressive black metal band called Crawlis that like does like Plato inspired, like Platonic philosophy inspired albums and stuff.
Yeah.
And so there's a depth to the world of metal that is really easy to miss by just saying, oh, well, every metal band just looked through a Latin dictionary and found the longest word they could find that didn't pull up another band on Bandcamp and said, all right, there we go. But, there's a lot of these people who also like think very deeply about religion and philosophy and just put it in a heavily occulted form. I found myself really also just being very happy about the Unicorn guys. Like, obviously, wishing that the characters had a better lot in life, but the idea too that like you can just play the music because you like it. You can just go out and play shows because it's fun to get in front of a crowd. I think that's a useful sort of thing to happen near the end of the series too, when it is becoming very clear that like nobody's getting famous.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is, most books about music or artists or whatever, it's always this like linear path of ascent, and then they, if they do flame out, it's because they went too high. There's this kind of Icarus thing going on, and yeah, I didn't think that was legitimate, I mean, maybe it is but I think it's almost like a way of reinforcing this false mythos, like musical mythos. And but yeah, exactly. So like so Unicorn is in there, and they're doing it for the right reasons, and they're fun to listen to. But I think, I guess, to get back to the musical history element of it, the idea that music could be fun in like 1994, that's a challenging idea, right?
Yeah.
Because there are lots of rules about like what things should be and what things should not be. So that's kind of interesting too, I think. Just, these characters that are renouncing all of these rules.
Yeah, something about metal, and I find this also with electronic music too, is that there's like a set orthodoxy, and then if somebody pushes outside of it too much, they get celebrated, but then a new orthodoxy gets placed around it really quick, which is why you have a million subgenres. You have, blackened deathcore, progressive blackened deathcore, because like it's the same thing as that, but they use 7/4 time signatures sometimes, and it's like way too different.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it's, again, it's an interesting thing. I mean, because like it is silly, and I see that that's silly too. But then I know for myself, if I'm like listening to music, I'm like, this is the right band to listen to, and I can't listen to that. Even though on the surface, I'm sure they're just like very minute differences, but for some reason I'm like, that's right, that's the right way to do it, that's the wrong way to do it, at the same time realizing that that's ridiculous. And then I guess, in the book, David, in this book, he really has that, because he starts to develop these friendships that are outside of metal, like his friend Abdul, and then his girlfriend. And so he's starting to have this whole world of friends who don't know anything about this at all, but then he's able to have this friendship with them where there aren't all of these rules and expectations on him, which I think in the beginning of the first book, I don't think, David Fosberg would have been able to do that.
Yeah. So it's a subtle change that he makes, right? Because he's still very much the same guy. I feel like he has many of like the same sort of values. It's just a more clear-headedness about the world at the end of the day, and then a more openness, right? Like he's more willing to try new things, at least, even if he doesn't like them.
Yeah, and I guess, I guess just for my writing, that's like, it's a very subtle difference. So it's, I don't know, so like something is happening. He is changing, but it's not like this profound awakening or anything like that. He just has a little bit more of a clear-eyed view of where he is in relation to this thing. But I think that's, for readers, right? Like for people in our lives, that's often enough. That's often all you really need.
Yeah, certainly. I feel like anytime you learn to let yourself enjoy something a little bit more, or something new, is a huge win. A huge win. I think the book too, using music, offers a sort of good thing for writers too. I feel like we're sort of working in this world where it's mostly writers reading books written by writers, right?
Yeah.
Most of the people who have read my books are either my family or people who also write books.
Yeah.
And I guess I can't speak to your sales numbers, but I imagine you probably experience close to the same thing. And it's, you know, when I look back in 10 years, all the people I know from this little corner of the writing world, like how many of us are really going to have made it?
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
that's a good point.
and how much of us are just going to continue writing because it's fun to do. It's a good way to
Right.
spend your time. It's a good way to flex your muscles. And I feel like the end of the book kind of brings a piece to that, where like you kind of see what happens, like what you have to do to make it, you know,
Right.
with the character who does sort of reach acclaim, and it's like, you know, you see that based on who that character was at the beginning and what they were doing at the beginning, and you're like, okay, so there were maybe a couple compromises made here, and if that's what you have to do, are you willing to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, like there are a lot of parallels, I would think, to how David's talking about metal to, yeah, to writing itself, right? And then I mean, this is the so Addle Addle, the press. This is
Mm-hmm.
their last book.
Yeah.
They're, you know, they're done. Uh, I mean, they're still doing Grindhouse, and they're building that up and done a lot of really amazing stuff with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting because of this whole world of indie lit, that there are a lot of writers releasing and making a lot of really cool stuff, but there's still kind of this threshold, I guess, as far in most cases, right, in terms of the I don't know, the reach of it, which is, I don't know, kind of tricky sometimes, I think, to think through.
Yeah. I'm wondering. I'm trying to remember if we talked much about uh, the autobiographical nature of this, because did we at all, or how autobiographical is this?
Oh yeah. We probably did, but it's like any writer, kind of just bringing together a lot of different things here. Like, I grew up in Miami, that's true. I lived in Belgium for a year as a Fulbright scholar when I was doing my doctoral
Mm.
dissertation. So that's true. Uh, I took Dutch classes. That's true. There are other things that are in there that are true, other things that are just kind of like, um, like imaginative reimaginings of things from metal history and stuff. So it's kind of a mix of a bunch of things.
So where I'm curious where you think or how you feel about contemporary metal then too. That's one of the things I kept thinking about, is like, it didn't necessarily feel in any of the books as though you were making a commentary on anything now, right? It didn't feel like there was a lot of foreshadowing, but I am interested in sort of how you feel about it. Or did you get to a certain point where you just kind of stopped listening to new stuff and found your set?
That's a good question. No, I don't know. I'm always kind of cycling through or listening to new stuff. But I also gravitate back towards stuff that I like. Like in my office, I have an iPod that it has a bunch of stuff on it. And when I'm working, I'm just kind of listening to whatever I downloaded there, circa, up to like 2010 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I'll, I guess as far, I think, I don't know, I guess as far as genres go, though, what's interesting is there are a lot of new bands that are doing stuff with, I guess, the approaches to metal that I like the most. So like there's a whole range of old school death metal bands, for example, that are new and that are basically redoing the first Incantation album.
Mm.
And that's fine by me, like Blood Incantation or Tomb Mold or those kinds of bands. So I like that. Um, or like there are lots of bands that are kind of redoing, like power metal, I'm trying to, and it's one of those things where it's either really good and perfect or not. Like Ambush is a really good band. Well, that's one of their albums I like a lot. Or I don't know, like a band like Haunt. Have you heard them?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, they kind of are redoing some of this 80s style stuff, and it's a little, anyway, it has some modern elements to it, but it's also still kind of classic in a lot of ways. So I like that. And then for this, just with the dungeon synth element to it. So obviously, I'm going to go back to like the first couple of Mortis albums, but there's, as we were talking about before this, there's so many different, really, like, I mean, I don't want to say groups because it's generally just like a single person, but so many projects that are doing so many interesting things. So, I feel like there's just so much to listen to, but there's not really a sense of like a center. I kind of feel like all of these different genres are existing in a modern way right now,
Yeah.
But as to like what the bigger band, for me, I just don't like things if they sound too polished. But I've always been like that.
Yeah. The sort of contemporary dungeon synth stuff feels so much like other internet-based musics, and that it splinters so fast, where it's like, well, there's cozy metal or cozy synth, and like dinosaur dungeon synth.
Diplodocus.
Yeah, Diplodocus is great.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, but that's a whole nother thing, right? Just like how internet culture is changing music genres, or really just art and writing in general. But I deliberately don't deal with that in these books, just because it is set at a particular time. And I might have a couple places where I allude to the present, but I try not to get into that too much.
Yeah. And I like that. I think there's something special about that just pre-internet time, especially in music, where you still have like locality as a defining factor in musical style. You know, like US black metal doesn't mean a whole lot to me the way that it might have meant something to somebody a while ago.
Yeah, well, and that element too of the object. So like David finds out that Inferno comes out, and then he wants to go and buy the copy and then he's pissed off because he doesn't get a free copy. And so this focus on the physical thing, and then he looks at the liner notes and he sees stuff in there. I write scholarship about metal also, so I've been doing some essays in that regard, and what I do, because it's because things are so splinted and fragmented, it's hard sometimes to have like something textual to connect to. I mean, because I'm an English professor, so what I find myself doing is focusing on liner notes themselves, like, as this is the textual object that I'm analyzing here, or I'm looking at or maybe a couple of them or something like that. But I think that now it would be harder to do that. I mean, if you're working with stuff that was like really recent, it would be harder to do that, I think. Although on the other hand, like with the dungeon synth stuff, there's so much of a focus on the physical, the tape even, right? Like the limited edition of 35 tapes or whatever. So there's that element to it as well. So I don't know.
Yeah. And there's definitely people doing stuff like that with books these days too, right? There's like M. Kitchell does stuff like that with his I can't remember the name of his press now. But it's like, yep, I'm going to print these out at home. There's going to be 50 copies. If you can't get them, I might upload the PDFs at some point.
Right. Or the publisher, I forget the name of it, but they do like limited edition hardcover books, books that have already been released, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, yeah, I don't know, which is kind of interesting because it's still part of like the indie lit world, but then it's making this object here that generally, I mean, I'm thinking if you're making like hardcover, you're wanting to sell it to a library or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who has the cash to you know, put out for that kind of thing.
All right. Well, before we wrap up here, then, do you have plans for something next? You alluded to it earlier, but do
Yeah.
you have any like kind of concrete things that you're working on?
Right now, it's so this is you know, this is coming out. It's basically well, I think it's actually out now. So Sinister Synthesizer is out now, so that's great. And then I I always kind of like alternate back and forth between creative stuff and scholarly stuff. Uh, I don't know. It just helps me, and I think just for work also, it's kind of nice to uh, you know, to work in different forms.
Mm-hmm.
So probably then, I mean, I have a few like scholarly articles that I'm working on, and then I'll figure out creative wise what to do. I mean, like I said, I do want to do a book about skateboarding because that's this other thing that's in my life that's been really important. And I think if I were to do it would be not a trilogy. It would be like a single volume. And instead of maybe just about one person, because I feel like with skateboarding, so much of that in my life has been about these different interrelated groups of people, like your skate crew or whatever, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so I'd want to show like all of these different kinds of friendships over time and maybe intermingling in different ways too. Um, I've written some stuff for it, but that's basically like the general frame for it. But also, as you know, I am very slow. So that might be another, you know, give me 5 years or something like that. We'll see what happens. I don't know.